BlackRock, I think I read the other day, increased salaries of everybody in the firm that's a full-time worker by 8%.
Yeah, so they know what's going on.
Yeah. They don't think it's 5.9% or 5.4%.
And they're like, they know their employees aren't dumb.
Like,
come on.
BlackRock's doing that. McDonald's isn't doing that, right? Shout out to everyone working at McDonald's, but like your employer's not giving you an 8% raise. We should confirm that that's actually true, that it was an 8% raise, but I'm pretty sure it was BlackRock gave all full-time employees an 8% raise across the firm in terms of inflation-related concerns.
Yeah, but 8% starting in September. All BlackRock employees will receive a base pay raise of 8%.
Base pay 8% up. What is the average increase of the hourly worker at name your company? 0. There is no increase, right? So we're literally watching as we see the white-collar corporations, they know what's going on, especially the ones in finance. An 8% base pay rate is insane when you compare it to an hourly wage worker that literally gets 0.
Well, when they release these numbers, they have to do like it's 5.9-ish. Like, you got to do an asterisk and disclaimer, basically being like, we don't know, and it's okay not to know, like we talked about, but you just need to let people know. Everywhere I've read online, like it's 5 point. There is no like, oh, it could be this, couldn't be this.
Well,
like,
because it's official. When you say it's the official number, it sounds like, oh, it's official.
Well, then you see, hey, let's take out transportation. Let's take out hotels.
On inflation numbers.
Yeah, on inflation.
Well, you know what, unemployment, right? There's always the like, well, who counts as having been employed? Like, if you're a freelance worker and now you don't have any freelance work, are you unemployed? Or were you always unemployed? Or did you actually never have full employment, right? Yeah. Or what happens if all of a sudden I wasn't a freelance worker, I was a 1099? What if I'm a gig economy worker? Does that count? They start to manipulate the data and you start to say, okay, it's pretty obvious the number's wrong. They're saying the number's wrong. How do we figure out the real number? I don't think you can. I literally do not think that you can at this point figure out what the real unemployment number is in this country.
Yeah. I've spent a lot of time reading the asterisk on surveys and stuff like that. They are ridiculous with it.
What do they say?
If you take out food and energy, it's actually 4.5. Well, if you take out everything, it's 0.
If you just take out the cost of all goods, then it's 0% inflation.
0% inflation,
yeah. Oh, that's part. We solved the problem. We should release our own, the best business show inflation numbers, and just say the best business show inflation number, removing food, energy, like just remove everything. 0% inflation. Like,
I paid $7 for an iced coffee yesterday at some place.
Did you get a special kind?
Yeah.
I mean, it had oat milk, but but that's free. That comes with it. But yeah, like
Oat
$7.
milk?
That's insane.
$7 is pretty high. Do we? Did you know that there's a drought in Brazil? If you got Brazilian coffee, that might be the problem. There's a really bad drought in Brazil right now that's causing the cost of coffee to spike, is what they're saying. But what I try to separate out is if there's a drought in Brazil that's driving the cost of Brazilian coffee up, okay, that makes sense. But that shouldn't make all coffee go up, right? Like that doesn't make a lot of sense. And the hard part about this, take coffee as a great example. Coffee, I don't know what the percentage it is up as kind of like an inflationary good. But if you think about what's causing the spike in coffee prices, some of it is supply chain disruption just because of COVID and all stuff. Some of it is weather related type stuff like Brazil's drought for Brazilian coffee. And then a lot of it is inflation. Right? So it's not just one thing. You can't just pinpoint and say, oh, it's inflation or it's a supply chain or it's weather or whatever. But in the totality of it, what we do know is that without a doubt, it is indisputable at this point. The cost of living is skyrocketing for people in this country. And if you're wealthy, hopefully your investments are outpacing that. And therefore, even though the cost of living is increasing, your asset base is increasing at a faster pace. And so you're okay. But the cost of living is still increasing. If you don't have those investments, the cost of living is exploding and you don't have any investments, and therefore you're just taking it right on the chin. You know what the coffee number is?
No,
You can't find it?
My computer froze.
See? You spent $7 on coffee, but you can't get a computer that works.
Nah, this thing's brand new.
I want to be clear. I've never bought a coffee for $7.
I'll take you there later. You can buy mine too.
I think that coffee is a huge is a great example. The other thing that I think we really are seeing is politicians are waking up to this, right? We talked yesterday about the New York Post on the front page talking about inflation inflation is trending on Twitter. You now see all of a sudden politicians realizing like, hey, this is going to play really well with the population. And so what do they start doing? They start hammering the Federal Reserve chairman. And so when we say it's an impossible job, we mean that it's impossible to make the decisions. It's also impossible to defend the decisions because you're never going to please everybody. If you try to go after full employment, right, and get that 5.9 official inaccurate number down to, let's say, 3.5% where it was back in January and February of 2020, you're going to do certain things that are going to make everyone else upset that isn't worried about full employment. If you then say we're not going to go after full employment, instead what we're going to do is we're going to address wealth inequality or we're going to address some other issue, then you're going to end up pissing off the full employment people. And so it's actually politics. That's what people don't understand is when you have individuals working at these institutions, especially ones that live in Washington, D.C., that spend time with people in Washington, D.C., that think like people in Washington, D.C., you get politics. And that's all this is you're getting the politicalization of monetary policy. And so what you get is somebody who is pretending to be independent. The Federal Reserve is not independent, but they're pretending to do that. But they still have to go and sit there and get questioned by lawmakers. How are you independent if constantly you have to report back to and answer to politicians? It's crazy that we pretend that this thing isn't happening. And therefore, we know that it's impossible because you can't please everybody in a political situation.
So I got the coffee numbers. Last week, it hit 60% year over year. It was higher. 60%, the coffee beans were higher.
I told you.
Yeah.
I didn't know that it was that high, but is that in like 60%, right? Is that the drought in Brazil? Is that inflation? Is that supply chain disruption?
They're blaming the drought in Brazil, supply chain.
Off the dome. You guys see that right there? It's almost like I read the article probably.
Do we
sure
expect like restaurants basically, right? So Chipotle recently raised their prices to combat higher it costs more to make it. Yep. Do we expect basically Starbucks, for example, to say, all right, well, it's 60% more this year, so you got to pay 60% more. We want to keep the same profit margin.
They're absolutely going to pass the cost on to the consumer. They have to, right?
Well, they're going to pass it off, but they're not going to bring it back down. Once it's a higher cost, it's a higher cost.
So this is a great point, right? Inflation as a metric, for those that don't know, inflation measures the rate of change. So it looks at last year compared to this year. Now, there are some people who will argue that last year's prices were artificially depressed because of COVID, and therefore there's this base effect, meaning that the base was a little bit lower, and therefore it looks worse than it actually is. Some goods, maybe that's true. Majority of the goods, that's definitely not true because the price didn't necessarily go down last year. Now, once you look at inflation and you see the rate of change, that's one data point. The data point that John's really talking about is just what's the actual cost, like the aggregate amount. So if I pay $7 for coffee today, right, they're not going to then all of a sudden, once the coffee bean price goes down in the future, they're not just going to say, oh, let's charge $5 again, right? No, they're going to keep the price at $7. That's why Coca-Cola's gone from 25 cents to $3, right? Is because they continue to ratchet up the prices. The cost of living is going up, but they never actually bring it down. So that doesn't mean that inflation can't come back down because the rate of change definitely is going to come back down. There's almost the inverse of the base effect, right? Now, all of a sudden, it's going to be at a higher level. So in the future, it's going to be harder to keep these sustained levels just on pure math. But the aggregate impact of the inflation will not go away because if you're getting paid that hourly wage, even if it's $10, $15 an hour, and now all of a sudden they've raised prices because people who run businesses have to take the higher input cost and pass it through to the consumer, they're not going to bring the cost down later. And therefore, you basically have that impact of inflation will remain after the inflation official numbers, inaccurate numbers come down, right? The number will come down over time, whether it's in 6 months or in 6 years, that number will hopefully come down. But the actual impact stays forever because they're not going to lower the prices.
Yeah, Powell, he's like, we'll just wait 6 months. We'll check it out then.
That's basically what they're saying.
We were talking about McDonald's earlier. I saw the Chipotle CEO, Brian Niccol, on CNBC the other day. Instead of McDonald's, if you're working there, you need to be working at Chipotle. This guy gave $15 minimum wage to everyone in the business. He said we have debt-free education programs, so you can go get a degree debt-free. And then they have a program now that every new employee gets entered into. Within 4 to 5 years, they expect you to be at $100K in salary if you stay and you do the program and you exceed and you do all this stuff, right, to become a manager. So crazy stuff there. But what the result of that was they raised prices on everything 4%. Right, on everything.
And Chipotle, on the whole board.
Yeah.
They just said, you know what? We're going to look at the whole board, 4% higher.
Yeah.
I thought inflation wasn't that high, right? Oh, wait, we forgot the core inflation number is 4.5%. CPI number is 5.4%. But don't worry, it's just transitory. The Chipotle prices will definitely come back down later. I promise. Don't worry about it.
I think part of it too, and one of the reasons why we started the show really is just education, right? And it's just educating people on the idea that stimulus, inflation, etc., reduces your purchasing power over time and makes it impossible to save yourself to wealth, especially if you're a low-income family or you're on minimum wage jobs or low-salary jobs. It makes it impossible. And no one's educating them, but it drives the inequality gap down. And Powell clearly doesn't give a shit, right? Like he was saying, hey, you got to come to my office and talk to me if you care. No one's going to do that, right? Like,
well, they might not be able to find him in the office because he might be at the GQ shoot.
Yeah.
Like you don't know where the guy is.